Alright, hello everybody. Welcome. If you're listening to this on Dwight Explains the Bible, welcome. So today we're going to be discussing the Gospel of Matthew Companion Guide, written by Reverend Joseph Callell, which is my pseudonym. So welcome. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the book chapter by chapter, and the book is set up where chapter 1 in the book covers chapter 1 in the Gospel of Matthew, and it goes on like that. So chapter 8 in the Gospel of Matthew is chapter 8 in the book. And it basically, what started this off was, I did kind of like a Google search or a word search in the Gospel of Matthew, and I looked up every time that the Gospel of Matthew said, this fulfills what the prophet said, or this fulfilled the prophecy, or anything like that, right? So I gathered all of those excerpts, and then what I did is I went in, we did a deep dive, and we were like, look, what did the prophets actually say? And come to find out, the Gospel of Matthew lies about everything. Everything it says is just a complete lie. So we're going to go through it together. Again, since this is my book, I can kind of quote it without copyright stuff. So here we go. So it starts off in chapter 1, right? The very first chapter. Like Christians will tell you, oh, don't even read the Old Testament. Go straight to the New Testament. That's all that matters, right? So the very first gospel in the Bible is the Gospel of Matthew, and that's the one we're going to look at. So it starts off trying to give a genealogy of Jesus. It says, this guy came from this lineage, from that lineage, and whatever else. And it's trying to prove that Jesus came from the bloodline of David, because that is one of the requirements of the Messiah, is that he came from the bloodline of the Messiah. So Matthew 1:1, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And goes on, it just starts naming the Father and the Son, going through who is who. Then we'll point out in Matthew 1:9, it says Uzziah, the father of Jotham, Jotham, the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Those are going to be important names that we're going to be looking at later. Because Matthew's going to quote that later, the story of Ahaz and Hezekiah. He's going to quote it later and say it's about Jesus, when literally in the 9th verse, he's already saying what's going on. So in Matthew 1:11, it says Josiah, the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. Josiah and Jeconiah, or in the Old Testament they call him Coniah or Cornelius. It's just a language thing. But Coniah has a broken lineage. Like, God cursed the lineage of Coniah and said that nobody from the lineage of Coniah would ever sit on the throne again. This is what God said, right? So if God said nobody sitting on the throne can come from the lineage of Coniah, then how can Jesus sit on the throne if he came from the lineage of Coniah? So we'd look back to where that came from. The very first thing, like I said, we're doing a deep dive, right? So Jeremiah 22, going verses 28 to 30, it says, is this man Coniah a despised broken pot, a vessel no one wants? It continues on, thus says the Lord, record this man as childless. A man shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judea. So, we're already seeing the lineage for Jesus already says he won't be sitting on the throne of David. So, the whole first part of the first chapter is just ridiculous. It's already going offline. So, we'll move on. Matthew 1:18. He already says, now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place this way, right? But we haven't established yet that Jesus is the Messiah. Matthew's trying to prop him up, but we know Matthew is a big fraud and a liar. So Matthew 1:23. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. So when we look at that verse, there's two parts with that. Again, the context of the first part of the problem comes from Isaiah chapter 7. And this is what we already talked about just a few seconds ago with the lineage with Ahaz being the father of Hezekiah. So this comes from Isaiah 7:14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. So what Isaiah, if we actually look at Isaiah, we look at the context, what's actually going on? So King Ahaz is having trouble with a couple nations around him. The northern tribes of Israel have ganged up with somebody else and they're trying to overthrow Ahaz's reign. King Pekah and King Rezin have teamed up and they're troubling King Ahaz. So the prophet Isaiah goes to the king and tells King Ahaz, don't worry about it. Here's a sign from God. The young woman who's with child, before that child is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, before you can drink milk and honey, the kings who you dread will be gone. Says Isaiah 7:16. The land before you, whose two kings you are in dread, will be deserted. So what's going on is God is telling King Ahaz to have faith, have strength, keep doing what you're doing, and the problem kings are going to be gone. And the sign is that this is all going to happen before this child that's born is old enough to, it like gets out of like infanthood or something, right? So the sign is literally for King Ahaz. And a lot of Christians will take this section out of context and say, no, it's talking about the Messiah. Well, literally, it's not. It's a sign for King Ahaz. If King Ahaz did not see this sign come to fruition, then it's literally not a sign for King Ahaz, is it? Right? So when Isaiah tells King Ahaz, this is a sign for you, it's a sign for you, King Ahaz, not a sign for people 2,000 years later, 2,400 years later, right? And it says literally so here's the thing with translations. A lot of the Christian translations of the Bibles, they go back to the Old Testament and change the words to fit a narrative. They want to make it say something it doesn't say. But if you go to the actual Hebrew text, it literally dispels a lot of these concerns, right? So if you go to a Bible school, a Bible college, seminary, they use good translations of the Bible. They use translations that actually say what the words mean, not what they're going to interpret them under the lens of the New Testament, right? The same way you don't read the New Testament under the lens of the Book of Mormon, right? Mormons would say you have to use the Book of Mormon to translate the New Testament to translate the Old Testament. People with the New Testament say you have to use the New Testament to translate the Old Testament. Well, the Old Testament is the Jewish Bible, and they're just saying, no, this is what God told us. This is what it means. So if you want to add a book, then add the Book of Mormon, right? You have to be a little honest with yourself. If we're going to start adding books to interpret, then you have to add them all. Add the Quran, add the Book of Mormon, right? So the original verse says the young woman is with child, not the young woman, or there will be a young virgin in the future who will be with child. That's not even a sign, right? Okay, so again, there was a two-part problem with Matthew 1:23. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. So the second problem is they shall name him Emmanuel. Who, if that's about Jesus, who named Jesus Emmanuel? Who called him Emmanuel? Right? We know the story of the angel visiting Mary and saying, "You will name him Emmanuel," but nobody ever did. Nobody ever called Jesus Emmanuel. Not once. So, if we go to the meaning of Emmanuel, God with us, then again, going right back to the very first section of Matthew 1, Matthew 1:9, Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. What does Hezekiah mean? Hezekiah is interpreted to be like mighty God, God with us, and all this stuff, right? The name Jesus or Yeshua, however you want to pronounce it or look it up, doesn't interpret to God with us in any way, shape, or form. Not at all, right? So this is literally saying they're gonna name a son God with us. And Hezekiah, now Isaiah 8, there it's talking about a child, and scholars like being straight honest here, there's two children who they think this child could be. One of them is Hezekiah, which means God with us. So it's more likely that it's one of these two children and not a magical child from the future, right? So when we read the rest of the Gospel of Matthew, and he talks about prophecies, we have to figure out, like, what is a prophecy? If I said, I like turtles, right? And then 200 years from now, somebody else says, I like turtles. Well, is that a prophecy? No, right? That's just somebody repeating what I said. Or, saying it independently of themselves. Maybe they quoted me, maybe not. But I would have to say something like, for it to be a prophecy, tomorrow when the sun rises, a turtle will fly across the sky, right? I'm making a prediction. That's what a prophecy is a prediction. So whenever you read anything in the New Testament that talks about fulfilling prophecies, go back to the original part, and we're going to ask a couple questions, just 3 questions. One, is this talking about the future, right? Is this thing here saying something will be happening in the future? And then pertaining to the Messiah, is it talking about the Messiah? Is this thing saying the Messiah is going to do this, or this is going to happen to the Messiah, right? Not just something that the person you think is the Messiah also did. We don't really care about that, right? We don't care that in Genesis 1:28 it says, the fruit from the trees will be your meat. Great. Well, Jesus ate fruit. That must be a prophecy. Well, I also eat fruit. Am I the Messiah? So the thing has to be clearly written about the Messiah in order to be a messianic prophecy, a prophecy about the Messiah. It's pretty simple. And then the third question we're going to ask is, did Jesus actually fulfill the prophecy? So is it talking about the future? Is it talking about the Messiah himself? And did Jesus actually fulfill this? So now let's move on to chapter 2. Taking a quick coffee break. Okay, chapter 2 of Matthew, the very first gospel. The very first book of the New Testament. Christians say, read the New Testament. Well, we've already looked at chapter 1 and it's full of lies. And that just sets the tone for the rest of the gospel, and then the rest of all of the gospels, the New Testament, everything. So Matthew 2:15, it says, and remained there until the death of Herod, that's Joseph and Mary. This was to fill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. So they're saying, okay, so they were in Egypt, and God calls them out of Egypt. That was supposed to be what happens with the Messiah, right? So again, here's some of the questions. Is this when we look at that prophecy in context, is it talking about the future? Is it talking about the Messiah? And is this something that the Messiah actually fulfilled? So what is he talking about? This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son. So we look at the Old Testament, and this is found in Hosea 11, the first couple verses 1 and 2, right? When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went for me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. But this is the only place in the Old Testament where it quotes, out of Egypt I called my son. But when we look at the actual context, we see, out of Egypt I have called my son. Who is God's son in the Old Testament? If we look at Exodus 4:22, Israel is my firstborn son. So out of Egypt I have called my son, Israel. Wasn't Israel a slave in Egypt and God called him out of there? So this was when Israel was just being formed, right? This was before the actual establishment of the tribe of Judah, the whole Israelite heritage, right? It started where God picked them up in Egypt. When Israel was a child, when they were young, they hadn't been formed yet, I loved them, and out of Egypt I called my son. So this is retelling of the Exodus, right? And the more I called from them, the more they went from me. Remember, Moses went up on the mount to convene with God, and in the meantime, the Israelites were all making like golden idols and stuff, and God got really mad. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. So, literally, this is recounting the early formation of the Israelites. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went for me. So, Matthew is saying that Joseph and Mary being in Egypt and waiting there until the death of Herod, this was to fulfill what had been spoken through the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. Well, what he's talking about has nothing to do with the Messiah. So, when we look at this and we ask the questions, is this talking about the future? Is Hosea 11 talking about the future? No, it's actually talking about the past. Is it talking about the Messiah? No, it's talking about the Israelites. Did Jesus actually fulfill the prophecy? Well, there is not a prophecy to be fulfilled here. So no, he didn't. So again, Matthew's lying even more. So moving on. So again, we all know King Herod. He was worried about the Messiah as the story goes. And King Herod ordered the execution of all the little babies around Bethlehem. And Matthew goes on to say, Matthew 2, starting in verse 17, this was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And here's the verse. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled because they are no more. Wow. That sounds pretty spot on, right? Well, let's look and see what Matthew was quoting. And it looks like he was quoting Jeremiah 31. Thus saith the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Thus saith the Lord, keep your voice from weeping, and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, says the Lord. They shall come back from the land of the enemy. They shall come back from the land of the enemy. So, what Jeremiah is talking about, if you actually read it in context, you hear Christians say, "Oh, context, it's out of context, it's out of context." But literally, that's the whole Bible. That's the whole New Testament is out of context. So when we look at what Jeremiah is actually saying and what's going on, the children of Ramah, right? They were taken slaves. They were captured by the Babylonians. So Rachel is weeping because her children have been taken captive. Right? Your kids have been captured. So the moms and dads are sad. Oh my God, our kids are gone. They're weeping, just whatever else. So that's what's happening. Or the slaves, or their kids have turned into slaves, and God is telling them, well, don't worry, they will be back. They will come back, right? So when Matthew says there was weeping in Ramah, a voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. This has nothing to do with King Herod executing kids because he's scared of the Messiah. Right? There's absolutely nothing to do with it. So again, Matthew is literally taking the verse out of context. So he's making stuff up to sell you a story. The next one on the list, we're still in Matthew chapter 2, chapter 2:23. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. So we'd expect, just from reading this, from looking at Matthew, that when we go back to the Old Testament, we would find something that says the Messiah would be a Nazarene, right? But when we look back, instead, what we find is a prophecy for a guy named Manoah and his barren wife. Judges 13:5. For you shall conceive and bear a son, no razor to come on his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from birth. It is he who shall deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. That's the only thing that talks about anybody being born in Nazareth. And it's not Nazareth, it's Nazarite, which is a different place than Nazareth. That city hadn't been established yet at the time of Judges 13. So it's Matthew just going back and saying, hey, these words sound cool, let me repeat them in my gospel, right? So then let's move on to Matthew chapter 3. So far everything in Matthew chapter 1 has been a lie, chapter 2 has been a lie. Chapter 3 is just a quick short one. But Matthew 3:3. This is the one whom the prophet Isaiah spoke when he said, the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord and make his paths straight. So we would expect something to do with the Messiah preparing a way for the Lord, or somebody else preparing a way for the Messiah. So a voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord and make his path straight. Well, this comes from Isaiah chapter 40. So Isaiah chapter 40 is the beginning of what's called second Isaiah. So all of chapters from 40 to 55 is called second Isaiah, and this recounts the Israelite captivity in Babylon and them being rescued from it. I didn't give a lot of good info on that one. I need to double back on that. So chapter 4, We're gonna read a couple verses. I took out a couple irrelevant verses. But we're looking at Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, 5 and 6, 8 and 9. And we're going to be discussing the last one. Then Jesus, this is when Jesus was going in the desert and he was being tempted by the devil, right? He fasted 40 days, 40 nights. The tempter came to him and said, "If you're the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." The devil took him to the top of the temple. "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. On their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against the stone." Again the devil took him to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. And here's the important part. And he said, "All of these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." All of these I will give you. So, who does the earth belong to? Who does the universe belong to, right? Doesn't it belong to God, aka Jesus? So, if I had a car and I let my friend use it, my friend can't come along and say, "I'll give you this car if you give me $1. It's my car, right? It's mine. I own it. I'm just letting you drive it, but it's mine, right? So this whole story just doesn't even make sense, right? And I think it was Matt Delahanty on the Atheist Experience who said something about this story. It'd be the same thing as you walking into my house and trying to sell me my television, right? It just doesn't make sense, right? So then, moving on, chapter 4, we're at verse 14 through 16. This is what had been spoken through so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. Those who sat in region and shadow of death, light has dawned. So this is the beginning of Isaiah 9, where they were praising King Hezekiah's arrival. So the child who is supposed to be born, or who is born, and the King Pekah and King Rezin will be dispersed before that child is old enough to eat milk and honey. They're talking about that child. Nothing to do with Jesus. So again, moving on. Matthew chapter 4, 18 through 20. This is just kind of funny, but as Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. So the thing here is, okay, so Jesus walked up, and these people saw Jesus, and to them it was just some random guy. Like, you don't know who this guy is, just a random guy. It's not like the Messiah. When you see the Messiah, he's going to be floating a foot off the ground. There's going to be a glow around him. He's wearing all these kingly and princely robes, and he has a crown. Nothing like that, right? It's just a dude. So a random dude said, "Hey, quit your jobs and follow me." And they're like, "Yeah, okay, sure, why not?" So that just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's just some random dude. Like, I'm sure there's times you see somebody and you can tell there's just something about them, there's something wild, but I doubt there'd be anybody... Why is my phone doing this? I doubt there would be anybody who could come up to you and say, "Hey, quit your job and follow me," and you'd be like, "Oh yeah, sure, I quit. Let me stop trying to make money and feed my family. Yeah, I'll quit." And another common theme we see in the Gospel of Matthew, starting here, Matthew 4, 23 and 24, Jesus went through Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria. They brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demons, epileptics, paralytics. He cured them, right? But here's the thing. This is what doesn't make sense. Why does Jesus only do close-up magic? Like, he only if you can see him, he'll heal you. But it's not like Jesus says, I heal everybody all at once. There's a voice from the clouds. I am the Lord your God. I love you and I heal you all, right? No, it's only close-up magic. Jesus is like David Blaine. He's a close-up magician. Only people who are close to him can see his magic. And like David Blaine, oh my God, he must be magic, right? Because he did this thing and I can't figure out what happened, right? Secondly, here's another thing. Why would God send God to earth to heal people of what God cursed them with? It says the diseases, the pains, epileptics, the paralytics, the people who are blind, people who are deaf. Like, Jesus cured all these people, right? But God is the one who made them that way, right? So God makes somebody blind, and then God sends God to cure their blindness. Thank you for undoing what you did to me, right? Exodus 4:11. Then the Lord said to him, who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Right? So God is the one who gives everybody their diseases. Christians will spin a big long story. Oh, it's because of sin. Oh, it's because of I don't care what the reason is. God is the one who did it. It's God's plan, God's design. Exodus 4:11. God himself, according to the book, is speaking here and saying, I'm the one doing this. So stop trying to come up with excuses for God. Right? God knows what he's doing, right? So God makes people blind, deaf, mute. God gives them diseases. He gives babies bone cancer. When you hear about kids dying in the hospital of bone cancer, that's God, right? Exodus 4:11. It's literally God saying, I did it. So here comes Jesus fixing what God did. So that doesn't make sense. And these people would know that, right? If these people believe in Yahweh, then they would know their own book or their stories where they would know that God did this to me. God cursed me with this, right? So let's move on. We're going to move on to Matthew chapter 5. Again, we're reading the Gospel of Matthew Companion Guide, written by Joseph Kallel, D.D. And if you look at my username, I'm Reverend Dr. Kallel, Doctor D.D., Doctor of Divinity. So that's me. It's one of my pen names. So Matthew chapter 5, 5:17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. So we'll read again and we'll stop. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. What is the law or the prophets? It would be the Mosaic law. That's the only law that Jesus would be talking about at the time. The Mosaic law. Jesus is saying, I come not to abolish. So abolish means get rid of. Right? Abolish means it's done. No more, it's a thing of the past. And Jesus said that's not going to happen. It's not going to be a thing of the past. Right? I'm not here to abolish the law, but I'm here to fulfill. I'm here to show you how you are supposed to do this. So, let's look at an example of abolishing and fulfilling. So fulfilling a law would be driving down the road. The speed limit says 30 miles an hour. So you're driving, you have your seatbelt on, you're staying in your lane, and you're going 29 miles an hour. You have fulfilled the law. But guess what? The guy behind you, he still has to do it too, right? So that's what fulfilling the law is in this context. People think it means fulfilling, like you placed an order. Like I ordered a pepperoni pizza and the pizza came here. Boom, no more orders, right? That's not what fulfill means, because if you fulfill it and then it's no more, then the no more is abolished, and Jesus literally said he does not come to abolish. Going on, Matthew 5:18. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. You'll see some translation saying, until heaven and earth have passed, not one jot or tittle or one stroke of the letter will be removed from the law, will change the law. So Jesus, if you actually read the red letters of the Bible, Jesus promotes the law again and again and again. And we'll get to the next part where Jesus says, if you teach people to follow the least of these laws, you'll be considered the least in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is promoting the law. God says, Deuteronomy 11:1, 12:1, 12:26, I believe, maybe 28, the law is going to be forever, right? God says following the law following the law makes you perfect. The Torah refreshes the soul. Following the law is doing what is good and righteous in the eyes of the Lord. Jesus comes along and says the same thing. Jesus says the same thing. Following the law is what you should be doing. Now, here we'll kind of fast forward a little past the book right now, but God tells you to follow the law forever. Jesus tells you to follow the law forever. The prophecies about the Messiah show that the law is forever, and when the Messiah gets here, he's going to re-establish all of the laws. Right? So like when the temple is destroyed, obviously you don't have a temple to do your sacrifices, right? But the Messiah is supposed to come back and he's supposed to build a temple. And the prophecies about the Messiah show that the Messiah will reinstitute the Mosaic laws, so there will always be sacrifices. It's not a one final sacrifice. That's not what the prophecies say. It's ongoing. We're going to keep having sacrifices again. You will never lack a man to have sacrifice, or the Levites will never lack a man to make sacrifices before the Lord, right? But then Paul comes along and says, oh, no, the law was just a schoolmaster to get us to Jesus. You can't follow the law. Nobody can follow the law, right? Well, obviously, Paul is disagreeing with God and Jesus. They disagree with each other. So who do you want to believe? You have God and Jesus saying follow the law always, to always follow the law, or you have a man who said, nah, don't worry about that. God tells you, if somebody speaks in my name and says things I did not say, you're not supposed to follow them, right? And isn't that what Paul is doing? He's speaking in God's name. Oh, Jesus told me this. But Jesus literally didn't say that. Jesus said the opposite. When Jesus was here, he never said anything about the law going away. God never said anything about the law going away. So they keep promoting the law. They keep promoting that you're supposed to be following the law, and then here comes somebody telling you something completely different. And God tells you that if a prophet comes along and speaks in my name and says things I didn't say, you're supposed to ignore him. Don't worry about them. Don't fear them, and they're supposed to be put to death, right? So one of the comments is, why am I talking about a fake person? I live in Louisiana, In Louisiana, all the classrooms have the 10 Commandments in them. They all are required by law to have the 10 Commandments. So the Bible is a book that's very relevant to me and all my fellow citizens. In Matthew 5:19, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. So the people in the kingdom of heaven are going to look at Paul and all his teachings, and people who promote Paul's teachings and say they are the least. So Jesus is basically telling you to follow the law. Paul is saying ignore Jesus. Matthew, still we're in chapter 5, verse 21-22. I'll read this pretty quickly. You have heard that it was said, those in ancient times, you shall not murder. Whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, this is Jesus, but I say to you, if you're angry with a brother or sister, that you'll be liable to judgment. If you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. It's kind of a weird way to say it, but the hellfire, right? The fire of hell. But he says liable to the hell of fire. So this is the first time we see Jesus speaking, and he makes the law even stricter. He's not getting rid of the law. He's not trying to do away with it. He's actually making it tougher. He's doubling down on it, right? Now, however, this obviously already makes Jesus not the Messiah. He's a false prophet, because in Deuteronomy 4:2, it says, you shall not add anything to what I command you, nor take away anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am charging you. So God literally said, don't add to this. He's saying, don't take away from this. And Jesus comes along and he's adding to it. He's making it tougher, right? And it's one of the things that Jesus did while he was here on earth, was call out the traditions of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He says, your traditions are making it hard for people to follow the law. Just follow the law, not traditions. Because what they did is they built things up. The hand washing ritual was a ritual added on to the law. And what Jesus is doing now is this same thing. He's adding on to the law. He's making it even harder. Says in Matthew 5:27-28, you shall not commit adultery. But Jesus says, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So there we go. Jesus again is violating God's commandments by adding or taking away from God's law. Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown in hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. So here, Jesus is being a little melodramatic, right? It's not that serious. If you mess up, you do better, right? That's one thing the law says. Nobody could follow the law. Nobody was perfect. Nobody could. Great. Well, the law doesn't expect you to be perfect. Just like our law today, right? You drive down the road, you get pulled over. What for? It could be anything. Speeding. Your license plate light bulb went out. The light bulb went out. Your registration. It looks like you have a crack on the windshield. You know, it could be any reason to get pulled over. Our law doesn't expect you to be perfect. The old law doesn't expect you to be perfect. Following it makes you perfect, but it doesn't expect you to be perfect. So what happens if you break the law? Well, back then, you would make a sacrifice, right? Maybe some turtle doves or something like that, or some grain offerings. Today, if you break the law, what happens? Well, you might have to pay a fine, $75 for whatever, you know. You parked in the wrong spot. Now you got to pay $20 and whatever, right? But we don't expect you to be perfect. We just give you guidelines, and if you don't follow them, this is what you do to get yourself right. So moving on, Jesus goes on to say that you should love everyone around you, not just your friends. He says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. But when there's an evil person, you're just supposed to let them go. You're supposed to love them and pray for them. That, like, one of my most cherished sayings is, evil triumphs when good does nothing. So, if somebody's doing something evil, you should be doing something. You should take charge. You should intercede, do something. Stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, right? And he says, love your enemy. Okay, well, isn't Satan the enemy? Do you love Satan? Do you obey Jesus and love Satan? Okay, so the chapter ends with Matthew 5:48. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So, Jesus is saying that God is perfect. Well, who is the character of God? Well, that's the guy from the Old Testament, right? So, when we look back at the Old Testament, God, or Jesus is referring to the God who killed 70,000 Israelites because their king committed a sin. This is in 2 Samuel 24. The king made a mistake, so God, unalived, he killed 70,000 Israelites because the king made a mistake. Like, please, if Biden or Trump does something wrong, don't come after me. Please, don't come after me. Go after them, right? If King David made the mistake, make him pay the price. And that's even what David said back in 2 Samuel. He says, why are you going after them? I'm the one that messed up. So, again, this is your pro-life God who doesn't give a crap about human life, right? But yeah, so be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The God who says you can buy slaves, make them slaves for life. You can beat your slaves. You can save virgin daughters as spoils of war, and so much more. This is the God that Jesus says is perfect. So that's the first 5 chapters, basically, of the Gospel of Matthew Companion Guide, which is only available on Amazon. But I'm going to take a break for now. I'm going to try to come back on later, today, tomorrow, before the ban wipes us all out, and finish the book. There's like 28 chapters. So I'll probably be on a couple times, kind of do this in bits. But I want to get this whole thing out. The book hasn't been selling great, but I really, 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 really just want people to know this information. I want people to do their research. And remember, anytime there's a prophecy, we have 3 questions to ask. Is this talking about the future? Whatever the Old Testament says, is it pointing to the future? If it's not pointing to the future, then it's not pointing to the Messiah. And then is it talking about the Messiah himself or the era of the Messiah where the world is going to be at peace, right? And then did Jesus actually fulfill the prophecy? There's so much more going on here. And the rest of the Gospel of Matthew, I mean, it's nothing but hogwash. And we'll get into it. So whether you follow me on TikTok, I'm going to try to upload this to my YouTube channel. I'm going to be uploading it to Dwight Explains the Bible, my podcast, available on Spotify and kind of anywhere you can find a podcast. But I'm gonna probably upload this in one chunk or maybe 2 chunks on the podcast. I don't know, but anyway, so thank you all for being here. And I'll be back later this weekend before TikTok kicks us out for good. So, thank you. Bye.